The day my billionaire husband smiled while signing our divorce papers was the day everyone believed I had lost everything, but none of them realized it was the first day I finally belonged to myself. The marble courthouse echoed with the quiet footsteps of lawyers, reporters, and curious strangers who had gathered for what social media had already labeled the divorce of the year. Camera flashes reflected against polished floors as people whispered behind expensive suits and designer handbags, eager to witness the end of a marriage that had once looked perfect from the outside. I sat quietly at the long wooden table wearing the same simple navy dress I had owned for years, my wedding ring still resting on my finger, my hands folded neatly in front of me. Across the room sat Ryan Whitmore, my husband of 10 years and one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in America. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly, his confident smile looked untouched by regret, and beside him sat Vanessa Cole, a glamorous social media celebrity whose flawless appearance seemed carefully designed for every camera in the room. She leaned toward Ryan with effortless confidence, occasionally whispering something that made him smile. The photographers loved every second of it. I heard someone behind me whisper, "She never stood a chance." Another voice quietly laughed. "Look at her. She's just a basic housewife." Of course, he moved on. Those words should have shattered me, but after months of hearing similar comments online, they no longer had the power they once did. The judge reviewed the final documents before calmly asking if both parties understood the agreement. Ryan answered first without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice carried the certainty of a man closing another successful business deal. When my turn came, I looked down at the papers for only a moment before answering softly, "Yes." My attorney gently nudged the pen toward me. I wrapped my fingers around it, paused for one quiet breath, and signed my name exactly where the final page requested. Claire Whitmore. The ink had barely dried before Ryan reached across the table, removed his own wedding ring, and placed it beside the documents. There was no anger in his expression, only polite distance. "I truly hope you find happiness," he said with professional courtesy, sounding more like a businessman ending a partnership than a husband ending a marriage. I looked at him for several seconds before offering the smallest smile. "I hope you find what you think you are looking for." Vanessa stood the moment the hearing officially ended and slipped her hand gently around Ryan's arm. Cameras exploded with flashes as they walked toward the courthouse steps together. Outside, reporters shouted questions from every direction. "Ryan, is this the beginning of your new life?" "Vanessa, are wedding bells next?" Nobody asked me anything. I quietly left through a side entrance carrying one small cardboard box that contained a framed family photograph, an old leather notebook, and the spare key to an apartment Ryan and I had shared before anyone knew his name. A cold autumn breeze swept across the nearly empty parking lot as I placed the box inside my aging sedan. I looked back once toward the courthouse where cheers and camera flashes still surrounded my former husband. The entire world believed they had just watched a billionaire leave behind an ordinary woman who had nothing left to offer. What none of them knew was that the most valuable thing I had ever owned had never been the mansion, the luxury cars, or the Whitmore name. It was the knowledge I carried inside that worn leather notebook, and before long, it would change everything. The little apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint and cardboard boxes, a sharp contrast to the mansion I had called home only 24 hours earlier. The living room held exactly 3 pieces of furniture, a second-hand sofa, a small wooden table, and a folding chair that doubled as my dining room seat. Sunlight poured through a single window overlooking a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles after school and neighbors still waved to one another across the sidewalk. It was not glamorous, but for the first time in years, every decision inside these 4 walls belonged entirely to me. I placed the old leather notebook on the kitchen counter before slowly unpacking the cardboard box I had carried from the courthouse. The framed family photograph was the first thing I lifted out. It showed Ryan and me standing in front of our first office almost a decade earlier, long before magazine covers, private jets, and charity galas. Back then we celebrated every new client by sharing pizza on the floor because we could not afford a dining table. People often assumed Ryan had built Whitmore Technologies alone, but they had never seen the nights I spent reviewing business plans, organizing investor presentations, or rewriting proposals after he had fallen asleep at his desk. I had earned an MBA before we married, yet when the company began growing faster than either of us imagined, I quietly stepped away from my own career because someone had to keep our lives from falling apart. I handled the household, coordinated charity events, managed family schedules, and listened to every idea Ryan wanted to test before presenting it to his executives. Somewhere along the way, the world stopped seeing me as Claire, and started calling me the billionaire's wife. Eventually, even Ryan seemed to believe that was all I had ever been. My phone vibrated on the counter. A news notification appeared across the screen. Billionaire Ryan Whitmore steps into new chapter with Vanessa Cole. Beneath the headline were hundreds of comments from strangers who knew nothing about our marriage. Some praised Ryan for choosing someone more exciting. Others mocked me for looking ordinary beside a glamorous influencer. One comment caught my attention more than the rest. She probably never contributed anything except cooking dinner. I smiled sadly before locking the screen. If they only knew how many boardroom strategies had first been scribbled into the notebook now resting inches away from my hand. I opened it carefully, turning page after page filled with handwritten market analysis, customer research, product sketches, pricing models, and leadership notes dating back almost 10 years. Ryan had often laughed and called it my impossible brain because I never stopped writing ideas down. He used to tell people I was his lucky charm. Somewhere between success and celebrity, luck became invisible. I carried the notebook to the small balcony overlooking the neighborhood and sat quietly as the evening breeze rustled through nearby maple trees. For the first time in months, there were no assistants knocking on the door, no luxury events demanding perfect smiles, and no expectations except the ones I placed on myself. I looked at the final page of the notebook and noticed a sentence I had written years ago after finishing graduate school. Never confuse the role you choose with the value you possess. I read the words twice before closing the cover. That notebook was never meant to preserve memories of the company I helped build. It was quietly waiting for the company I was finally going to build for myself. The following Monday began with the unfamiliar sound of my own alarm clock instead of the quiet voice of an assistant reminding me about charity luncheons or gala dinners. I dressed in a simple beige blazer, packed my old laptop inside a canvas bag, and carried the leather notebook beneath my arm before locking the apartment behind me. My bank account looked very different from the life I had lived only a week earlier. The divorce settlement had been fair by every legal standard, but I refused to touch more money than I needed. If I wanted to prove something to myself, I wanted to build it with my own decisions, not with Ryan's fortune. I spent the morning sending resumes to consulting firms, technology startups, and investment companies across Chicago. Hours passed without a single reply. Some recruiters politely explained that I had spent too many years outside the workforce. Others questioned why someone with an MBA had no recent executive experience despite being married to one of the country's most successful business leaders. None of them knew that many of Whitmore Technology's earliest expansion plans had begun as handwritten notes inside the notebook resting beside my laptop. By early afternoon I stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop to organize my thoughts. The place was small, warm, and filled with students typing assignments while freelancers quietly worked beside large windows overlooking the street. I ordered the least expensive coffee on the menu and opened my notebook once again. As I reviewed old market research, I noticed a middle-aged woman sitting alone 2 tables away watching me with quiet curiosity. She wore a tailored emerald blazer, silver-framed glasses, and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. After nearly 20 minutes, she walked over holding her coffee. "May I ask you something?" she said politely. I smiled and nodded. She pointed toward the notebook. "Those diagrams are impressive. Are you preparing a business proposal?" I hesitated before answering. "Not exactly. They are ideas I collected over many years." She asked if she could sit down, and before long we were discussing customer behavior, leadership culture, emerging technology, and why so many companies ignored the needs of ordinary families. The conversation flowed so naturally that I completely forgot we had just met. Nearly an hour later, she gently closed the notebook and looked directly at me. Most people repeat theories they learned in business school, she said. You speak like someone who has solved real problems. I laughed softly. Unfortunately, nobody seems interested in hiring someone who spent the last decade being a housewife. The woman smiled knowingly. Titles rarely tell the whole story. She reached into her handbag and handed me a simple business card. Eleanor Grant. Founder and chairwoman. Grant Strategic Ventures. I recognized the name immediately. She had built one of the most respected private investment firms in the country. Before I could say anything, she stood and adjusted her jacket. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, she said. Do not bring a resume. Bring that notebook. I have a feeling everyone else has been interviewing the wrong version of Claire Whitmore. As she disappeared through the front door, I looked down at the worn leather notebook resting in my hands. For the first time since leaving the courthouse, someone had not seen a divorced billionaire's wife. She had seen a businesswoman waiting to be remembered. The next morning I arrived at Grant Strategic Ventures 15 minutes early, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I had spent too many years understanding that preparation often mattered more than confidence. The building overlooked the Chicago River, its glass walls reflecting the rising sun across the water. Inside, everything felt quiet, purposeful, and free from unnecessary luxury. There were no oversized portraits celebrating executives, no walls covered with awards, only teams of people already discussing ideas before the workday officially began. A receptionist greeted me warmly and escorted me to the top floor where Eleanor Grant was already waiting inside a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. A single notebook rested on the polished table. Mine. I had left it with her the afternoon before. Eleanor looked up with a welcoming smile. Good. You came. She pushed the notebook toward me before taking a seat across the table. Do you know how many business plans I review every month? I shook my head. More than 300, she answered. Most are beautifully designed and completely forgettable. Yours is different because it was never written to impress investors. It was written to solve problems. I thanked her quietly, unsure where the conversation was leading. Eleanor folded her hands together. Tell me something honestly, Claire. Why did you stop believing you belonged in business? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down at the notebook for a long moment before answering. Because everyone slowly stopped asking what I thought. Eventually, I stopped asking myself. Eleanor nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer. She stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city skyline. I built this company after spending 15 years being told that women should stay in supporting roles while someone else accepted the credit. I recognize that look because I used to see it in my own reflection. She turned back toward me with calm determination. I am not offering you a management position. I am offering you something far more difficult. My heart began to race. What is that? She smiled. An opportunity to earn your confidence back. Instead of placing me in an executive office, Eleanor assigned me to a small innovation team working on struggling startup investments. My desk sat beside recent college graduates, analysts half my age, and entrepreneurs who had never heard my last name before. Nobody cared that I had once attended charity galas or lived in a mansion. They only cared whether my ideas solved real problems. During my first week I listened far more than I spoke. I studied market reports, reviewed failed business proposals, and stayed late organizing research after everyone else had gone home. One evening, while the office had nearly emptied, a junior analyst admitted he could not understand why a promising technology company kept losing customers despite having a superior product. I quietly opened my leather notebook, flipped through years of observations, and drew a simple customer journey across a blank page. Within 20 minutes the entire strategy changed. The problem had never been the product. It was trust. The following morning the revised presentation reached Eleanor's desk. She read it in silence before looking around the conference room. Who developed this? She asked. The young analyst hesitated before pointing toward me. Eleanor smiled knowingly, exactly as she had in the coffee shop. I thought so. As everyone congratulated the analyst for helping refine the proposal, I realized something unexpected. For the first time in years, I did not need anyone to know the idea had started with me. I simply needed the chance to keep proving that I had never stopped being the woman who could build something extraordinary. 5 years have a quiet way of changing everything without asking anyone for permission. The small apartment where I once unpacked my life became a memory. The folding chair was replaced by conference tables filled with ambitious people, and the worn leather notebook slowly transformed from a private collection of ideas into the foundation of a company that investors now described as one of the fastest-growing technology consulting firms in the country. Grant Strategic Ventures had become more than my second chance. It had become the place where Eleanor Grant challenged me every single day to think bigger than survival. 3 years after joining her firm, she offered me the opportunity to lead a new division focused on helping struggling businesses rebuild through customer-centered innovation. 2 years later, that division became an independent company. Eleanor invested first. I invested everything else I had. We named it Horizon Dynamics because every business deserved the chance to discover a new horizon instead of being judged by its worst season. The first year tested every promise I had made to myself. Clients rejected proposals. Investors walked away. Competitors dismissed us as inexperienced. There were nights when I slept on the office sofa because I could not justify driving home for only 3 hours before another presentation. Yet every setback reminded me of the sentence still written on the final page of my notebook. Never confuse the role you choose with the value you possess. I read those words before every important meeting. Gradually, the impossible became routine. 1 client became 10. 10 became 50. National publications began writing about our unusually high success rate, helping companies reconnect with ordinary customers instead of simply chasing quarterly profits. Employees who had once worked for corporations where nobody listened to them now found themselves building ideas around one conference table where every opinion mattered. That culture became our greatest competitive advantage. On a bright spring morning exactly 5 years after my divorce, I stood in front of the glass entrance to Horizon Dynamics headquarters preparing to welcome another group of new employees. The building was not the tallest in Chicago, but every floor represented a decision made through patience rather than pride. Eleanor stood beside me with the same calm smile she had worn the afternoon we first met inside the coffee shop. "Do you remember what you told me on your first day?" she asked. I laughed softly. "Probably something nervous." She nodded. "You said you had forgotten whether you belonged in business." She looked toward the growing crowd of employees entering the building. "I think they would disagree." Before I could answer, my assistant hurried across the lobby carrying a tablet. "Claire," she said with excitement, "Forbes just released this year's leadership rankings." She turned the screen toward me. There, beside my photograph, appeared a headline I never imagined seeing. Claire Whitmore named one of America's most influential chief executive officers under 40. I stared at the words in complete silence. Not because of the recognition itself, but because I realized something unexpected. The title that once would have meant everything now mattered far less than the journey behind it. I looked around the lobby filled with people whose careers had grown alongside mine and quietly slipped the old leather notebook back into my briefcase. It no longer represented dreams waiting to happen. It had become proof that the person everyone once underestimated had simply needed the chance to remember who she had always been. Success has a way of revealing truths that failure keeps hidden. While Horizon Dynamics continued expanding into new markets across the country, Whitmore Technologies slowly began disappearing from the headlines that had once celebrated its unstoppable growth. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. A delayed product launch. An important executive quietly resigning. A disappointing quarterly earnings report explained away as temporary market conditions. Financial analysts remained optimistic, but those of us who had spent years studying business patterns knew that isolated problems rarely stayed isolated for long. One Monday morning, my executive team gathered around the conference table for our weekly strategy meeting. As the presentation moved from one client update to another, my chief financial officer paused before changing to the next slide. A familiar company logo appeared on the screen. Whitmore Technologies. Claire, he said carefully, our market intelligence team believes they are preparing another restructuring. I studied the reports in front of me without saying a word. Revenue had declined for 6 consecutive quarters. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped steadily. Several long-term corporate clients had quietly moved their contracts elsewhere. None of the numbers shocked me. What surprised me was the reason behind them. Every customer survey repeated the same complaint. The company had stopped listening. Years earlier, I had written exactly those words inside my leather notebook after one of Ryan's first investor meetings. Technology changes quickly. People do not. Ignore customers long enough, and they eventually stop believing you care. I closed the report and continued the meeting without commenting. My past no longer guided my decisions. My responsibility belonged to the people sitting around that table. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited my office carrying 2 cups of coffee, just as she had done countless times over the past 5 years. She noticed the Whitmore report still resting on my desk. "You expected this, did not you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. A company can survive losing money for a while. It cannot survive losing curiosity. Eleanor smiled thoughtfully. And Ryan? I looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the Chicago skyline before answering. I do not know the man he has become. I only remember the one who used to ask questions before making every important decision. Across town, Ryan faced a very different afternoon. Business magazines that had once praised his leadership now questioned whether Whitmore Technologies had lost its innovative edge. Several board members reportedly challenged recent strategic decisions, while investors expressed growing concern over expensive branding campaigns that generated attention but failed to improve customer loyalty. Vanessa remained highly visible across social media, documenting luxury vacations, fashion events, and exclusive parties, yet industry reporters increasingly noticed that she appeared far more interested in cameras than company meetings. The contrast between public image and business reality grew larger every month. As evening settled over Chicago, I gathered my belongings and placed the old leather notebook into my briefcase before leaving the office. My assistant stopped me just before I reached the elevator. "Tomorrow morning you have a meeting request from one of the largest technology firms in the country," she said. "They are looking for a strategic consulting partner on a multi-billion-dollar transformation project." I glanced at the company name printed across the schedule and felt my footsteps come to an unexpected stop. Whitmore Technologies. 5 years had passed since I walked away carrying nothing except a cardboard box and a notebook full of forgotten ideas. Now the company that once believed I had nothing left to offer was asking for a meeting, completely unaware that the chief executive officer waiting on the other side of the conference table would be the woman they had once dismissed as ordinary. The conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline had hosted hundreds of negotiations, but none of them had ever carried the strange mixture of history and destiny waiting behind its glass doors that morning. My executive team reviewed the final presentation while I quietly stood beside the window holding the same leather notebook that had traveled with me through every chapter of my life. Outside, the city moved with its usual confidence, unaware that 2 people who had once built dreams together were about to meet again from opposite sides of the boardroom. My assistant entered with a calm smile. "Their delegation just arrived." I nodded and closed the notebook before placing it inside my briefcase. Years earlier I would have worried about what Ryan might think when he saw me. Now my only concern was whether Horizon Dynamics could genuinely help another company rediscover its purpose. The conference room doors opened precisely at 9 o'clock. Several Whitmore Technologies executives entered first, followed by outside legal counsel and financial advisors. Ryan walked in last. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Time seemed to pause as recognition replaced surprise across his face. He had expected an experienced consultant. He had not expected me. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly from confidence to disbelief. The room remained completely silent until one of his vice presidents politely cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore?" Ryan never took his eyes off me. "Claire," he said quietly, almost as though he doubted his own voice. I offered a professional smile. "Good morning, Ryan. Welcome to Horizon Dynamics." He slowly looked around the room before his attention returned to me. The company logo behind my chair, the executive leadership team seated beside me, the presentation prepared under my direction, and finally the nameplate resting neatly on the polished table. Claire Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer. He stared at the title for several long seconds without saying another word. I invited everyone to take their seats and began the meeting exactly as planned. We reviewed market research, customer behavior trends, operational inefficiencies, and long-term recovery strategies. Every recommendation was supported by measurable data rather than opinion. As the discussion continued, Ryan spoke less than anyone else in the room. Instead, he quietly watched me explain concepts with the same calm certainty he once admired years before when we spent evenings discussing business plans around our tiny apartment kitchen table. Halfway through the presentation, one of Whitmore Technologies' board representatives interrupted. "Your customer retention strategy is unusually specific. Have you implemented this model before?" I smiled politely. "Several times." I changed to the next slide, revealing measurable improvements from previous clients across multiple industries. The principles are simple. Customers remain loyal when companies remember they are serving people rather than quarterly reports. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the presentation as though he had heard those exact words somewhere before. I recognized the expression immediately. He remembered. Years ago, I had written almost the same sentence inside my notebook after one of our earliest planning sessions. When the meeting concluded, executives began exchanging business cards and discussing scheduling details. Ryan remained seated until the room had nearly emptied. Finally, he stood and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not pride, confidence, or frustration. It was quiet realization. "I thought I knew exactly who you were," he said softly. I met his eyes with complete honesty. "No, Ryan. You only knew the role I chose to play. You never took the time to meet the woman behind it." Ryan asked if we could have 10 minutes alone after the meeting, and for reasons I could not completely explain, I agreed. The conference room gradually emptied until only the two of us remained, separated by the same polished table where multi-million-dollar decisions had just been discussed. 5 years earlier we had signed divorce papers across another table, believing the conversation between us had ended forever. Now silence settled between us once again, but it felt entirely different. Ryan looked older than I remembered. The confidence that once seemed effortless had been replaced by the quiet weight carried by someone who had spent too many nights trying to solve problems without finding the right answers. He glanced toward the leather notebook resting beside my briefcase before looking back at me. "That customer strategy," he said softly. "You wrote it years ago, did not you?" I smiled gently without triumph. "Yes." He slowly sat down again as though his legs no longer trusted him. "I remember reading something almost identical while we were building our first software platform." I nodded. "You asked me what I thought customers wanted. We stayed awake until 2 in the morning rewriting the entire proposal." Ryan closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I used that presentation to win our first major investor." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I reached into my briefcase, opened the worn leather notebook, and carefully turned through pages filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and dates stretching back more than a decade. I stopped at one page and gently slid the notebook across the table toward him. At the top of the page was the date from nearly 9 years earlier. Beneath it were 3 handwritten ideas. Build trust before selling products. Measure loyalty before measuring profit. Every customer wants to feel remembered. Ryan stared at the page in complete silence. "These became the foundation of our customer strategy," he whispered. I turned another page. Market expansion recommendations. Another page. Employee leadership principles. Another. Subscription pricing models. Another. Product launch timelines. Every section carried dates that proved they had existed years before Whitmore Technologies publicly introduced those same ideas. Ryan slowly looked up at me, his expression filled not with embarrassment but with genuine disbelief. "Why did you never tell anyone?" he asked quietly. I leaned back in my chair and answered with complete honesty. "Because we were building a marriage, not competing for credit. I believed your success was our success." The words seemed to reach him more deeply than anything else I had said. He lowered his head, gently rubbing his forehead with one hand. "Somewhere along the way," he admitted, "I convinced myself those conversations were simply us talking. I never realized how much of the company had been shaped by your thinking." I smiled sadly. That is what happens when someone becomes invisible one small moment at a time. Nobody notices the disappearance because it never happens all at once. Ryan carefully closed the notebook before sliding it back toward me with the same respect someone might show an irreplaceable family heirloom. "Claire," he said quietly, "I have spent 5 years believing I lost my marriage because I chose the wrong person. Today I realized something much worse." I met his eyes without speaking. His voice grew almost unsteady. "I lost my marriage because I never truly saw the extraordinary woman who had been standing beside me from the very beginning." The weeks following our meeting changed more than either of us expected. Horizon Dynamics began a comprehensive evaluation of Whitmore Technologies, sending specialists into every department to study customer experience, employee engagement, and operational efficiency. My team treated the assignment like every other project, guided by facts instead of history, but outside the conference rooms another story was quietly unfolding. Financial journalists began asking uncomfortable questions about Whitmore Technologies that had nothing to do with declining revenue. Several investigative reports noticed unusual marketing expenditures connected to luxury lifestyle campaigns that generated millions of online views but produced almost no measurable business growth. At the center of nearly every article was Vanessa Cole. What had once looked like glamorous publicity slowly became a pattern of expensive image building that benefited her personal brand far more than the company itself. One afternoon my communications director entered my office carrying a stack of newspapers. "You should probably see this," she said. Across the front page of a national business publication appeared a headline that immediately caught my attention. "Internal Review Questions Years of Executive Branding Decisions." The article explained that Whitmore Technologies had launched an independent audit after investors demanded greater transparency regarding several high-cost promotional partnerships. None of the accusations involved illegal conduct, but the numbers painted a troubling picture. Millions of dollars had been invested in luxury campaigns while customer support centers, product development, and employee training received fewer resources each year. That same evening Ryan called me for the first time since our divorce. I almost let the phone ring unanswered, but something told me the conversation mattered. His voice sounded quieter than I had ever heard it. "The board completed its preliminary review today," he said. "They found years of decisions I should have questioned much sooner." I listened without interrupting. "Vanessa convinced me that visibility was the same thing as trust," he continued. "Every time someone challenged another expensive campaign, she argued that modern companies had to dominate social media before anything else. I stopped asking whether the attention actually helped our customers." I closed my eyes, remembering the countless evenings years earlier when Ryan and I had debated marketing ideas around our tiny kitchen table. We had always reached the same conclusion. Real loyalty could never be purchased with appearances alone. "What happened?" I finally asked. Ryan took a slow breath. "The audit discovered confidential campaign proposals prepared by our marketing team were quietly reused to grow Vanessa's personal business partnerships. Nothing was stolen, but almost every major promotion helped her public image far more than it helped the company." There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment in himself. I ignored warning signs because I wanted to believe I had made the right choices after our divorce. His honesty surprised me more than the revelation itself. "Ryan," I said gently, "sometimes people do not lose everything because someone deceives them. Sometimes they lose everything because they stop listening to the people who once challenged them to think differently." The line remained silent for several seconds before he answered. "You always challenged me." I only realized how valuable that was after I surrounded myself with people who agreed with everything I said. When the call ended, I stood beside my office window watching the lights of Chicago reflect across the river below. 5 years earlier I believed another woman had taken my place. Now I understood something far more important. No one had ever replaced me. Ryan had simply walked away from the partnership that had quietly made him a better leader, and for the first time in his life, he finally understood the cost of that decision. 2 days after our phone conversation, Ryan asked if I would meet him for coffee away from boardrooms, lawyers, and executives. I hesitated before accepting because I knew this meeting could not change the past, but it might finally allow us to understand it. We met at the same neighborhood coffee shop where Eleanor Grant had first recognized something in me that I had forgotten to recognize in myself. The place looked almost unchanged. Students filled the corner tables, quiet conversations drifted through the room, and afternoon sunlight spilled across the wooden floor exactly as it had 5 years earlier. Ryan arrived a few minutes late wearing a simple navy jacket instead of an expensive tailored suit. Without cameras or shareholders nearby, he looked less like a billionaire and more like the young entrepreneur who once believed every problem could be solved with enough determination. After ordering coffee, neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "I owe you an apology that should have happened years ago." I looked at him calmly, allowing him to continue. "For a long time I believed I left our marriage because we had grown apart," he admitted. "That was easier than admitting I had stopped paying attention to the person who understood me better than anyone else." He lowered his eyes toward the coffee cup resting between his hands. "Success became addictive. Every award, every interview, every headline convinced me I already had the answers. Instead of surrounding myself with people willing to challenge my thinking, I surrounded myself with people who applauded every decision. I remembered countless evenings when I had questioned risky investments or suggested waiting before expanding too quickly. Back then Ryan usually welcomed difficult conversations. Somewhere along the journey, disagreement began to feel like disloyalty instead of partnership. He reached into his briefcase and carefully placed a thin folder on the table. "These are copies of our earliest business plans," he said quietly. "I spent the last week reviewing every document from the first 3 years of Whitmore Technologies." I opened the folder and immediately recognized my own handwriting filling the margins with notes, revisions, customer research, and strategic questions. Ryan smiled sadly. "I counted them." I looked up in surprise. "Nearly 70% of the handwritten revisions came from you." His voice became softer. "I spent years accepting praise for ideas that were never mine alone." I closed the folder without saying anything. No award or public recognition could restore the years that had already passed. Ryan leaned forward slightly. "Claire, I am not asking you to forgive me today. I am not asking for another chance. I only need you to know that I finally understand what I failed to see." His honesty carried no expectation, only regret. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. "Ryan," I answered gently, "there is a difference between being sorry because life became difficult and being sorry because you finally understand the pain you caused." He nodded slowly. "I know." A faint smile crossed my face. "Today I believe you belong to the second group." For the first time in many years, peace settled quietly between us. We were no longer arguing about who had been right or wrong. We were simply two people acknowledging truths that had arrived far too late to save a marriage but not too late to change the people we would become. As we stood to leave, Ryan looked at me with sincere gratitude. "Thank you for becoming the woman you were always capable of being," he said. I smiled warmly before walking toward the door. "Ryan," I replied without turning around, "I did not become someone new. I finally stopped hiding the person I had been all along." 3 weeks later, the consulting agreement between Horizon Dynamics and Whitmore Technologies reached its most important milestone. Months of research, interviews, customer surveys, and operational reviews had finally become a complete transformation plan capable of saving thousands of jobs across the company. Early that morning I stood inside the executive conference room reviewing the final presentation with my leadership team. Charts covered the large display, outlining practical changes that focused on rebuilding customer trust, strengthening employee leadership, and simplifying the company's increasingly complicated product strategy. As I looked around the room, I felt proud not because of the size of the contract, but because every recommendation reflected the same values I had believed in since the earliest pages of my leather notebook. When we arrived at Whitmore Technologies headquarters, the atmosphere felt very different from our first meeting. Employees greeted us with cautious optimism rather than uncertainty. Several managers stopped to thank my team for listening to frontline workers whose ideas had gone unheard for years. Before the presentation officially began, Ryan quietly approached me outside the boardroom. "No matter what happens today," he said sincerely, "thank you for giving this company a chance it probably did not deserve." I smiled gently. "Companies are made of people, Ryan. Most of them never caused the problems we are trying to solve." His expression softened as though those words had lifted a burden he had been carrying for months. Inside the boardroom, directors carefully reviewed every recommendation. Some questioned the cost of restructuring, while others worried about how quickly changes could be implemented. Instead of defending my ideas emotionally, I answered every concern with research, measurable outcomes, and examples from companies that had successfully rebuilt customer confidence after difficult periods. Nearly 2 hours later, the chairperson of the board finally spoke. "If we approve this plan, how many positions can realistically be preserved?" I looked directly around the room before answering. "Based on our projections, more than 3,000 employees will keep their jobs because this strategy focuses on rebuilding the business instead of reducing the workforce." Silence followed. Then one director slowly nodded. Another followed. Within minutes every board member voted in favor of the transformation plan. Relief spread quietly across the room. Several executives shook hands with members of my team, while others immediately began discussing implementation schedules. As people gathered their documents, Ryan remained seated, watching employees through the conference room's glass wall. 5 years ago, he said quietly after everyone else had stepped outside, "I thought success meant proving I was right. Today I finally understand that leadership begins the moment you are willing to admit you were wrong." I looked toward the busy offices where hundreds of people continued working, completely unaware that their futures had just become far more secure. "That realization will help them far more than any presentation I could ever give," I replied. Ryan stood and extended his hand, not as a former husband asking for forgiveness, but as one chief executive officer thanking another for protecting something bigger than either of them. I accepted the handshake with genuine respect. The cameras waiting outside captured the moment almost immediately. By evening, business headlines across the country described the agreement as one of the most remarkable corporate recoveries of the decade. Yet none of the articles mentioned the decision that mattered most to me. I had been given every opportunity to let resentment guide my choices, but instead I chose to protect thousands of families whose lives depended on a company finding its way back. In that moment I realized true victory is never measured by watching someone lose everything. It is measured by having the power to destroy and choosing instead to rebuild. The celebration surrounding the successful transformation slowly faded, but one conversation still remained unfinished. A week after the board approved the recovery plan, Ryan called and asked if I would meet him one final time. His voice carried no urgency and no expectation. It sounded like someone who simply wanted to leave the past in a better place than he had found it. We met at the small public park where we had once celebrated Whitmore Technologies securing its very first office lease. Years earlier we had sat on the same wooden bench sharing sandwiches because we could not afford an expensive restaurant. The park looked almost unchanged. Children laughed on the playground, runners followed the lakeside trail, and autumn leaves drifted gently across the grass as though time had decided some places deserved to remain exactly as they were. Ryan arrived carrying a small velvet box. Without saying a word, he sat beside me and placed it carefully between us. I recognized it immediately. Inside rested my original wedding ring. During the divorce I had left it on the courthouse table, believing that chapter of my life deserved to end completely. Ryan looked down at the box before speaking. I kept this because I thought one day I might find the right words. He smiled sadly. It turns out there are no perfect words. I gently lifted the ring from the velvet lining, allowing the afternoon sunlight to reflect across its familiar surface. So many memories lived inside that simple circle of gold. It reminded me of our first apartment, late-night business ideas, grocery lists written on sticky notes, and dreams that once belonged equally to both of us. It also reminded me how easily love could become hidden beneath ambition if people stopped protecting it. Ryan took a slow breath. Claire, I know I cannot ask for another chance. I lost that privilege years ago. I only wanted to return something that always belonged to you. I looked at the ring resting in my palm before quietly closing the box again. Thank you, I said sincerely. Not because I need the ring back, but because you finally understand what it represents. He nodded, waiting for me to continue. It was never about the jewelry. It represented two people promising to see each other every day, even after life became complicated. A gentle breeze moved through the trees as neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally Ryan smiled with peaceful acceptance. I spent years believing success meant never losing. Now I understand that real maturity sometimes begins by accepting what cannot be recovered. I reached into my handbag and removed the old leather notebook that had quietly connected every chapter of my journey. Beside it lay the brass key to the tiny apartment where our story had first begun. I placed the notebook back into my bag but left the key resting in my hand. Some memories deserve gratitude instead of regret, I said softly. They remind us who we were before the world told us who we should become. Ryan looked toward the lake, then back at me with genuine warmth. I hope whoever shares your future understands how extraordinary you are from the very beginning. I smiled peacefully. The most important person who needed to understand that was me. I slipped the wedding ring into the velvet box, closed it gently, and placed it beside the brass key inside my handbag. Neither object represented a future waiting to happen anymore. Together they had become quiet reminders of a life that had shaped me, lessons that had strengthened me, and a chapter one could finally close with gratitude instead of pain. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the National Leadership Forum overlooked the Chicago skyline, its walls lined with entrepreneurs, educators, investors, and young business owners who believed that great leadership should improve lives rather than simply increase profits. As I stood backstage waiting to accept the National Chief Executive Leadership Award, I quietly reached into my handbag and touched the familiar edges of the old leather notebook before closing it once more. I no longer carried it because I needed reminders of my abilities. I carried it because it reminded me never to overlook the quiet potential hidden inside other people. The announcer called my name, and warm applause filled the room as I stepped onto the stage. Bright lights illuminated the audience, but instead of focusing on the cameras, I noticed dozens of Horizon Dynamics employees smiling proudly near the front rows. Eleanor Grant sat beside them with tears of quiet satisfaction shining in her eyes. She had once given an overlooked woman a chance to begin again, and tonight her faith stood before the entire country. As I accepted the award, I looked across the audience and unexpectedly recognized Ryan seated near the back of the ballroom. He applauded with genuine pride, not because of who I had once been to him, but because he finally understood who I had always been. Our eyes met for only a brief moment, and we exchanged the smallest smiles. No sadness remained between us. Only respect. When the applause settled, I stepped toward the microphone and looked around the room before speaking. People often believe success begins the day someone finally notices your talent, I said calmly. My experience taught me something very different. Success begins the day you stop asking other people to define your worth. The ballroom grew completely silent. There was a time when I believed sacrificing my own dreams proved my love. Today I understand that healthy love never requires someone to disappear. The strongest relationships are built by two people who continue growing without asking the other person to become smaller. I paused, remembering every difficult step that had carried me to that stage. If you ever feel invisible, do not assume you have no value. Sometimes the world simply has not learned how to see you yet. Keep learning. Keep building. Keep believing in the person you already are. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted far longer than I expected. After the ceremony ended, young entrepreneurs gathered to ask questions, employees celebrated together, and reporters requested interviews about Horizon Dynamics' remarkable journey. As the evening came to a close, I quietly stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the city lights. Chicago stretched endlessly beneath the night sky, filled with countless stories still waiting to be written. Eleanor joined me carrying 2 cups of coffee, just as she had the afternoon our paths first crossed. She smiled warmly. "You know," she said, "the world calls you one of the most influential chief executive officers in America." I laughed softly. "That is nice." She raised an eyebrow. "Only nice?" I looked across the skyline before answering. "Because the title is not the achievement I am proudest of. The greatest victory of my life was learning that my value never depended on someone choosing me, staying with me, or believing in me first." As we stood together watching the lights shimmer across the river, I realized my story had never truly been about losing a billionaire husband or becoming a chief executive officer. It had always been about remembering the woman who existed long before either title entered my life. And once I finally remembered her, no one could ever make me feel ordinary again.